big surprise, fossil evidence is contradicting what the Bible's saying, the story that the Bible's painting.
That's right. And when colonizers came to the Americas and realized, hey, there's a new people, a race of people that perhaps we were not accounting for, that perhaps we have no clue how these people got here, right? So, and this is real. Like in the American continent, there's so much evidence of indigenous people in the Americas well over 20,000 years ago. Bible history only talks about 6,000 years of existence. And so this caused many theologians and apologists to try to harmonize or find evidence because, the Bible can't be wrong, right?
Welcome to Apostate of Mind. Were Adam and Eve really the first humans? Does the Bible even say that? That's what we're going to be discussing today as we do a response video to one of Michael Heiser's teachings on the topic. And today we're going to be discussing that with my partner and co-host, Mark Peralta. So before we jump in, Mark, tell us a little bit about who Michael Heiser is.
Yeah, Michael Heiser is a popular Bible scholar. I think he's evangelical. He's now passed, so he's former, actually. But he's done quite a bit of videos, written lots of books. One in particular, one that we've personally dealt with in the past, The Unseen Realm, for which he's very famous for. I know you have something to say about that, so.
Yeah, The Unseen Realm, something kind of interesting about that is after we left the church and deconverted, I had a friend from the church where Mark was a pastor invite me to do a book study on this Unseen Realm book. And so we got to dive deep in the topics. And what I noticed about Dr. Heiser is that I can agree with a lot of the scholarship that he presents and a lot of its mainstream scholarship. But then he always, at the end, kind of twists it back to Christianity or tries to justify it anyway. And in my Bible study, one thing I really noticed is everybody was really struggling because he was agreeing with the scholarship, but then it was like, well, wait a minute, if all the scholarship's true, then that means that there's, for example, all these other gods and just all these other problems. So I'm excited to dig deep with you in some of the problems with his claim today.
Yeah, and this one in particular gets really interesting because it deals with this whole biblical doctrine that, there's this God created first an Adam and then Eve. And so he's going to address that. I think he's got some good points, but I'm pretty sure we're going to disagree on some others. So I can't wait to get that video started and, see what comes out of this.
Let's jump into the video.
Most people who have grown up in the context of Western civilization have heard of Adam and Eve, the first human couple described in the first two chapters of the Bible, the book of Genesis. After describing in chapter 1 God's announcement to the heavenly host to create humankind, that's Genesis 1:26, and then going a little bit beyond that for the purpose in Genesis 1:27, the biblical text zeroes in on the details of human creation in Genesis 2. In Genesis 2:7, we read, "Then the Lord God formed the man of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature." Then a few verses later in Genesis 2:21 and 22, we read this, "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man." Now, the biblical narrative proceeds to talk about Adam and Eve's children and how the rest of humanity as a whole came from Adam and Eve and their subsequent offspring. For instance, in Genesis 4 and 5, we get that sort of information. So according to a face value reading of the Bible's earliest chapters describing the creation, specifically here the creation of humanity, it seems obvious that humanity came from Adam and Eve in the biblical story. They are the lone progenitors of the human beings in the story. Now, believe it or not, some people, even biblical scholars, don't think that it's that obvious.
Here I want to pause because I just, there's a few things that I think I need to flesh out. So notice first when he said a face value reading. Okay. What that means is just simply reading the text and taking it for what it's worth, right? With that, you're going to be ignoring critical analysis, critical scholarship on these texts. And one of the first assumptions that he's made that I'd say is incorrect. He was very subtle when he said it, but he first referred to Genesis 1:27, where it's the whole Imago Dei passage where it says that God created man in his image, and in his image, blah, blah, blah. And the way that most evangelicals interpret this, because rabbinical scholarship doesn't really see it that way necessarily. They're just thinking that their God made humans in his outward appearance, in his actual image. Christianity tries to add additional layers of interpretation by saying that also it means that God created them with a purpose that is divine. And so then he makes that link over onto chapter 2 when all these bad things happen, sort of like as a way of saying this is part of God's plan. And therefore, chapters 1 and 2 are somewhat continuous, like it's all part of one narrative.
And Heiser even has a point in his book where he explains that made in his own image could mean image as almost a verb, like imaging. He's projecting this godliness to his people, like what makes us special and set apart. So that's another interpretation that he adds.
Yeah, very good. And so those are all things that he is adding onto the text that does not come from the text. Mm-hmm. And so with regards to this subject, well, the text doesn't really say that these were the very first two human beings ever living, right? It doesn't specifically say that. It's almost just implied. Mm-hmm. But there are some things in the text that need to be analyzed because it doesn't seem to be that clear, though. There could possibly be an issue there. And we're going to see that later on with the narrative about Cain and the aftermath of that.
Okay.
He's presupposing what scholars refer to as univocality.
And what's univocality?
Univocality is the assumption that there is one voice, literally, in the sense that all these books together are all communicating one meaning, and that there is one meaning. We just have to demonstrate what that is, but that there is one meaning. And the problem with that is, as scholarship has pointed out with the documentary hypotheses, chapter 1 comes from a completely different source than chapters 2, 3, and 4 and on. It's known, the first one, the chapter 1, is very much it's a priestly tradition. It's a transcendent God working from outside in the creation. And chapters 2, which there's another creation narrative there, is more of a Yahwist tradition where it's an anthropomorphic God, literally, creating man out of clay. And he's interacting personally. It's not this God from afar. So two different traditions. What that means is you can't really hyperlink chapters 1 and 2 together like that because they didn't come originally this way. Mm-hmm. So
the other interpretation I hear a lot is almost like this hidden meaning that's behind this text, and that's what makes them sacred, is like God is speaking through these stories to you. And I think that's kind of just a creative way to add meaning to something that is deemed to be a little nonsensical. Because it's nonsensical at face value is why you have to add all these hidden meanings, or even just kind of adding your own parallels or connections through the stories, but not necessarily God intending that to be the case.
Some believe that the Bible actually suggests that there were humans on earth that didn't come from Adam and Eve and that were there at the same time as Adam and Eve and their own children. Now, that might sound really odd, but the idea has been around since the 17th century. It's really not new. You might wonder, well, how in the world could someone think that? Well, let's find out. Now, why would anyone presume that there are human beings in the biblical story who did not descend from Adam and Eve? Every idea that people have about the Bible has a context, and this one is no different. There's something that sort of prompts the discussion. So let's just start there. In broad terms, the idea that the Bible actually has evidence of alternative human races was prompted by the discovery of human beings in geographic locations not spoken of in the Bible, like North and South America. Such discoveries back in the 15th and 16th centuries naturally gave rise to the question of how humans who were presumably Adam's ancestors could be present in places that prior to the age of discovery in the earlier 16th century were not even known to exist. How could this set of circumstances have arisen? Now, these other humans did not look completely like their European discoverers. Again, the white Europeans who crossed the Atlantic, discovered North and South America, they had a particular appearance, and these other people they were discovering did not. Further, a lot of these people didn't even really look like Near Eastern people or Middle Eastern people, or even Negroes that the Europeans knew of because of their exploration in other areas. Many Bible believers at the time felt a sense of urgency to find these other people in North and South America somewhere in the Bible for the sake of preserving biblical authority and biblical integrity. Consequently, theologians and other scholars scoured the Bible for evidence that other human races could be found somewhere in the pages of the Bible. Again, specifically, human races that did not descend from Adam and Eve. Now, there were two views of other humans in the Bible that sort of emerged from this matrix. One is known today and was known then as pre-Adamism. What that means is that there were human beings on the earth before Adam and Eve. And the other view was co-Adamism, that there were human beings, again, in the pages of the Bible that were living alongside or in addition to Adam and Eve and their own descendants.
So here I want to just maybe add some commentary here, because you see what's happening, right? So big shocker, the Bible is not teaching all of human history, right?
Big shocker, big surprise, fossil evidence is contradicting what the Bible's saying, the story that the Bible's painting.
That's right. And when colonizers came to the Americas and realized, hey, there's a new people, a race of people that perhaps we were not accounting for, that perhaps we have no clue how these people got here, right? So, and this is real. Like in the American continent, there's so much evidence of indigenous people in the Americas well over 20,000 years ago. Bible history only talks about 6,000 years of existence. And so this caused many theologians and apologists to try to harmonize or find evidence because, the Bible can't be wrong, right?
Exactly. The way I see it is, so far the options he's proposing, pre-Adamism and co-Adamism, both pose a problem to what the Bible is saying. If it happens if there are people before Adam, that means the Bible story wasn't accurate. If they were there at the same time, that means the Bible wasn't accurate.
Yeah, and then who created them? Like, where did they come from? Like, are we missing a part of another creation? You know, what I think is that these people in the ancient times, they noticed that there are some different races of people, right? You've got really dark people, you've got, different features. And but collectively, we recognize that perhaps we are like the Israelites, this Canaanite race. But these other races, we don't know where they came from. What I suspect is that in antiquity, they believed that just like Yahweh made them, perhaps other gods made other human races.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's why you see a lot in the Bible, the God of Israel, it's very specific to a certain region and peoples and not God of the world.
Yeah. And in fact, that's the sort of thing that Michael Heiser gets heavily criticized for, is because he highlights those very polytheistic, the heritage of the Israelite religion that is very much pantheon, part of that.
Right. So right now he is an apologist who is admitting that the fossil evidence contradicts what the Bible says. And let's see how he's going to try to justify that.
Later on, in the wake of Darwin's theory of evolution, which had obviously a tremendous impact, pre-Adamic and co-Adamic theory became a means, for at least some people, to explain fossil hominids, such as those of Neanderthal man. So like I said before, every sort of theological idea drawn from the Bible has a context. And in this case, the context is centuries old and arose from circumstances that prompted certain very specific questions. Now, it's one thing to say scholars and theologians believed they could find humans in the Bible outside the line of Adam and Eve, but quite another to demonstrate the idea from the Bible. So we would naturally ask, well, what's the biblical basis for saying that there were other humans in the Bible besides those who descended from Adam and Eve? The idea is basically articulated in light of textual oddities in Genesis, specifically Genesis 4. Now, this chapter introduces Adam and Eve's first two children.
By the way, he is right in saying that the Bible doesn't teach that other people coexisted or existed prior to Adam and Eve. Doesn't say that, but we're going to look at the text where you might have to reason that, or you have no choice to reason but that there were other people existing or coexisting with Adam and Eve.
By the way, I think it's worth mentioning that the DNA evidence also disproves the concept of Adam and Eve, the concept that we came from one common couple ancestor. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, I've heard of the Adam and Eve gene, because that's something that there's been a little bit of confusion about that, because it was, there was a project where they named the gene Adam and Eve gene and trying to basically convey the concept of, the most ancient ancestors. But that's not to say that they were part of the same community or that they mated together and that it was literally the Adam and Eve as described in the Bible. That's not what the evidence points to.
Yeah, and not to mention that evolutionary biology has demonstrated that, this is scientific fact, that human beings didn't just come from nothing, right? So human beings descend from great apes. We evolved from different influences that precede us, number one. And number two, that speciation, right, how we differentiated from our predecessors, is something that only occurs at the community level, at the population level. You see what I mean? So there's never like a one new species, in a sense. It's a whole joined effort, and it takes time, and it never happens like something like a flip of a switch. It's an emerging property that takes time, and again, it happens at the community level, doesn't happen at the individual level ever. So why should we make an exception with human beings?
Related to this topic, I think it's worth mentioning another story in the Bible that's been disproven, and it's related because it's related to the concept of different cultures, different peoples, and that's the story of the Tower of Babel. And that story is explaining that the reason why we have different languages is because God, punished everybody and spread everybody out across the world and made them start speaking different languages, and that explains the fact that we have many different languages, whereas we've learned that languages have evolved over time, slowly, like one language kind of evolving into another, branching into another. And that's really how it worked. Similarly to our genetic variety, it's not that we came from one group and committed inbreeding and incest to the point of having biodiversity. That doesn't even make sense, because we know that incest produces genetic mutations and genetic problems and not intelligence as we see now.
And then, of course, there being like one couple that we're all humans descended from.
Mm-hmm.
Brothers Cain and Abel. And as the story proceeds, Cain murders Abel, meaning that at that point in the biblical story, there were only 3 humans on earth, at least again from a surface reading: Adam, Eve. The same chapter as Cain kills Abel, we read the following when God judges Cain for his crime. Genesis 4:10-17 reads as follows. And the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him 7-fold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, did you catch the 3 things in that passage that suggest there were other humans around when you would think there's only Adam, Eve, and Cain? If there's only 3 people on earth, Adam, Eve, and Cain, who in the world was Cain afraid of? Okay, it says he's afraid that someone is going to kill him. Well, who would he be afraid of? Where did he get his wife? Again, this is kind of an old question that people are familiar with. Where does Cain get his wife? Because there's only Adam, Eve, and Cain. Well, he found a wife somewhere. And how in the world, thirdly, could he build a city all by himself? Again, Genesis 4 very plainly says he went out and he built a city and he named it after his son Enoch. Now, the unexpected odd wordings here that seem pretty inconsistent with the flow of the biblical story create the distinct impression, again, at least in the mind of some, that there were other human beings on earth besides those who descended from Adam and Eve.
So you see
the statements of Genesis 4.
So you see what's happening there, right? The objections are legitimate, so they somehow have to be able to harmonize the fact that you do indeed have just 3 people there. In order for Cain's concern to be reasonable and legitimate, right? There must have been other people out there that he would have by way of experience, right? That it's very likely that someone will take vengeance upon me killing Abel. And the lack of response from God, because he could have been like, well, what are you concerned about? There's just you and your parents. Don't worry, or whatever. Just let him go. No big deal. But that's not what happens. Notice that the text said that he settled in the land of Nod or something, as if like it was already named. Like, isn't that a little suspicious though?
Yeah.
Because at this point, it's just them three just outside the garden.
Right. It presupposes if the town has a name that it's a town, and a town usually has people and infrastructure and, you know, some kind of system if they organized enough to name it. You would think.
So let's see how he handles this.
Appear incontrovertibly to be in support of the notion of alternative human races in the biblical narrative. That conclusion is not at all clear. In fact, it's a bit overstated. There's one major flaw that allows opponents of pre-Adamism and co-Adamism to argue that those ideas are pretty much bogus. And that is, the biblical narrative provides no sense of the passage of time for the events and therefore the statements in Genesis 4 that are used to support pre- and co-Adamism. In other words,
okay, I do want to make sure that we get him correctly here, because I think he just said that Genesis 4 does not offer any time marker or makes no reference to the passing of time. But I think he's incorrect. But let's back up and hear him again.
And that is, the biblical narrative provides no sense of the passage of time.
Provides no sense of the passage of time. Okay? Now, why don't we turn to Genesis 4 and see if indeed that's the case. Okay, so here's where I think Michael Heiser makes a crucial mistake, in that he either ignored what I'm about to show you or he didn't see it. We were just in end of chapter 4 where, God has that conversation with Cain, and then he puts a mark on him to protect him, which is kind of weird. Then it says, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, which I think it's kind of odd, but it's all right. So then it says, there's a little paragraph here that says, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and named it Enoch after his son Enoch. And then kind of finishes the chapter saying Adam knew his wife again. Okay. And she bore a son, named him Seth, which is their third child. Okay.
What does it mean to know your wife again?
Oh, yeah. So that is a euphemism for sex. So what that means is that Adam and Eve had no sex after Cain, and then they have sex again and had a child.
Gotcha.
And so this is where we could suppose that out came a bunch of people that eventually became descendants that Cain could marry, and Cain would worry about taking some sort of retaliation. Unless he was afraid of Adam, Cain really had nothing to fear. Now, the question is, when is actually Seth born in relationship to this narrative that we just read? When is he born? And then number two, how are we getting descendants from Seth? Because
exactly, we've got another son. We can't make babies with 3 sons, and so we've got another son, but again, now we need another woman for Seth in addition to the one for Cain, right?
Right. So we're not even close to having a girl for Cain. Are you with me so far? Now, he said there is no time marker. But check this out. If we scroll down to Genesis 5, where it says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. So here's a marker where it's telling us that not only that Seth, who was the next descendant down, could not have the ability to procreate children on his own, but that he wasn't born until Adam was 130. And so what that tells me is that the birth of Seth must have been way after the whole narrative and the issue with Cain and Abel. You see? So if that's the case, then we have to rule out the possibility that anyone that Cain met later on would have been a descendant of Adam and Eve. Like, this makes no sense. Where did the wife really come from?
That don't make no sense. There's more and more problems no matter what theory you adopt.
So let's see how he's going to crawl out of this hole.
For the events and therefore the statements in Genesis 4 that are used to support pre- and co-Adamism. In other words, readers are never told how many years pass during Cain's judgment and wandering in exile, and the time that he marries and builds a city. It doesn't even tell us, for instance, how much time passes between the time Cain meets his wife and the time they decide to have children.
It doesn't really matter how much time has passed. I mean, according to the story, there shouldn't be a reason to have a woman around to be his wife. So there's already problems with it, regardless of the time frame.
Yeah, I mean, and how ridiculous would it be? Like, there's only 3 humans alive, and then he's just like thinking way ahead, like hundreds of years ahead of the possibility of somebody retaliating. Or like, how do you figure out this woman? But he's going to try to stretch that. He's going to put some subjectivity to it because, the Bible is not very clear. And what I suspect is really happening here is that these traditions, like the Abel and Cain rivalry, an archetype of 2 brothers that they're at each other's throats, they envy each other, and one of them kills the other, perhaps has its own tradition that was then grafted into the Adam and Eve narrative. Like, we have every reason to suspect that many of these patriarchal narratives and these early on Genesis stories are actually just different traditions stitched together. So when you do try to make sense and put logic into it, you're going to run into some problems. Because if you presuppose univocality, that means the whole thing's got to harmonize. And so in doing so, you've got to make these stretches to try to make it all fit.
So far, I don't see a way he's going to make it all fit, but let's see what else he has to say.
The fact that Cain was worried that someone would kill him could simply mean that he anticipated that other people would eventually be on the earth, again, from his parents, Adam and Eve, and that one of them would eventually hear what he had done and go out and try to kill him.
Right. So he knows there's no people around, but he's going to imagine that there might be, and that they would have seen what he did, know what he did, and are going to kill him. That's their justification, that he just imagined this? Come on.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Given that biblical age spans before the flood, and this is from Genesis 5, the very next chapter, could be centuries long, one could argue that hundreds of years pass, allowing thousands of humans to be born from Adam and Eve. And it would be those people from which Cain could find a wife. And of course,
because the text also says that Adam and Eve had sex like 2 horny rabbits, and we're pumping up all these babies. I mean, what we know so far, it took them about 100 and something years to have sex again. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, if we're going to take the Bible at face value, we just read that.
And don't even get me started on the reproductive health of a 130-year-old. Like, there's no evidence, as far as I know, y'all can tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, there's not evidence that people have been able to reproduce at age 100 and something plus.
Yeah, you know what I actually heard in seminary was that the reason why people lived that long back then, and the reason why perhaps they were so fertile, is because prior to the flood, this is pre-flood, there was a canopy of water that encircled the earth, and that all this moisture trapped more oxygen, and so there was a higher concentration of oxygen, and so people were healthier and they lived longer. Although I don't think they were considering that oxygen can actually be poisonous to human beings if we were to breathe it in increased concentrations, but never mind that.
That's more an example of them trying to make puzzle pieces fit where they don't. Like, we know we don't live that long. Well, back then there was different factors at play to where it's possible, fathomable that you could have lived that long.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence of that? Any fossils that have been dated to be 100 and something years old and pregnant? No. They're just saying it's possible just to make it work.
Yeah, it's not impossible.
Yeah.
It's never impossible. Never say never.
There you go.
Of course, get help to build his city. Cain's worry from the perspective of such a rebuttal as that eventually someone would be a threat, is workable given those long age spans in the biblical narrative. His worry again would refer to the future, not his present time. Readers just don't know, though, because there's no sense of time passage in Genesis 4.
God could have said, hey, you know what? Perhaps you've got a couple of 100 years before anyone could be a threat to you. So why don't you go relax, Cain? Chill. But no, he put a mark on him. That's an outward sign for people to see. So it's Yahweh is going along with this foolishness.
Or not. Now, this means that ultimately, to use Genesis 4 to argue for human lineages outside of Adam and Eve, to do that, you have to make certain assumptions about what's going on in the passage, specifically assumptions that all of these events occur one right after the other, that they're all in the present time. And again, opponents of these ideas.
How about the assumption that you're making that the Bible is true? That's a big assumption.
Can say, no, that isn't true. These events occur hundreds of years apart, centuries apart. And that provides enough time for Adam and Eve to have more children, and those children have children, and so on and so on.
Again, I feel like the problem isn't the timeline. The problem is incest and inbreeding and only mentioning that you're having sons, and there's problems beyond. I mean, the time doesn't explain away all those problems.
What's ironic is that their usual critique of evolution is that scientists say, well, just give it enough time and things work out, which is actually a straw man.
Mm-hmm.
But here they're using that in their favor, which is funny.
So on, from which these other humans in the storyline anyway, could be accounted for. And so what we have here in Genesis 4 is ambiguity. Any interpretation of these statements in Genesis 4 must of necessity be driven by certain assumptions. They are not self-evident from the text. So we need to go back to the question we asked earlier. Does the Bible...
Yeah, and one of those assumptions that he makes is what I said earlier about unilocality. Because what's very likely the case here is that these narratives they have separate origins, and they were sort of stitched together into a sequence. And so now the theist who believes this is the inspiration of a God, who believes that Moses wrote Genesis and that God gave him all this information, that it therefore must all work together and harmonize, When in reality, when you read it critically, when you think about it critically, when you compare to what we know and have been able to prove in science with regards to evolution and speciation, this is impossible.
I feel like what he's doing is he's looking at all the problems and just saying, well, it's ambiguous. We don't really know. But the problem is that these statements are contrary to the evidence that we're seeing. So there's not enough time that can justify it. And there's not a rationalization of it just being ambiguous that would still not make it make sense. It still doesn't make sense.
Will teach there were humans besides Adam and Eve that do not descend from Adam and Eve. Well, again, the wording is important. Does the Bible actually teach that idea? If the question is worded that way, the answer is no. The evidence is ambiguous at best. So saying the Bible teaches that is an overstatement, an exaggeration. We might say that the Bible allows the idea, but that isn't the same as affirming the idea. So ultimately, the answer really has to be no if the question is worded that way. Thanks for watching.
As many things in apologetics conclude, there's no real answer that you can know, and God is mysterious, and you just got to accept it. That's it. Well, there's a much more reasonable answer, and that is just that the Bible's literature. It's not literal, and that's why it doesn't make sense with what we see, the fossil evidence that we see, the genetic evidence that we see, the archaeological evidence that we see. It's painting a different story.
And not just that, but also we are able to notice how the text isn't perfect. That if there had been a deity that was thinking and was inspiring this, and there was this vocality, like I mentioned before, that such God would not make such a mistake, because it's an obvious discrepancy from reality. If Adam and Eve are really the first two human beings, and these things are unfolding the way the Bible itself is describing it to be, it doesn't make sense for Cain to go out and find a wife, right, when they're the only ones. And yeah, here again, Michael Heiser found a way to make the text ambiguous enough to say, well, we really can't know for sure. He even lied a little bit when he's claimed that there were no time markers, and there are, and only to conclude that no, that you cannot claim from the Bible that there were human beings that coexisted with Adam and Eve, because in the end, they've got to reassure their audiences that the Bible is correct and perhaps there are no flaws or issues, but indeed they are. All right, folks, and with this, we conclude our episode of Apostate of Mind. I'm Mark Peralta.
I'm Apostate Ann.
And this has been Apostate of
Mind.
Call me a